Today we have the dirtiest World Chess Championship match in history between Anatoly Karpov and Viktor Korchnoi. This was played back in 1978, so they didn't have Stockfish or any of these bad boys, but they did have to get up to some crazy shenaniganry just to win the psychological warfare aspect of the game. Even to the point where Viktor Korchnoi's team accused Anatoly Karpov of hiring a hypnotist to try and distract him from the game. Can you imagine just trying to focus at a world champion level and there's some guy in the crowd waving a pendulum back and forth trying to get you to blunder your queen? I mean, that's just insane. But that's not all. There were also accusations of x-rays being pointed at chairs which could correlate to somehow cheating, and Karpov received a blueberry yogurt from his team without actually asking to it prior to that point. And Korchnoi got all suspicious, thinking that this was a message about the position on the board, and he protested this blueberry yogurt. But it turns out that the yogurt was actually Karpov trolling because of the accusations from earlier. I'm going to be going over a game between these two gentlemen so you can get an insight into how brilliant these guys were and probably didn't need to cheat. Anyways, let's get right into it. Karpov playing as white and Korchnoi playing as black. Starts off with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. Not going after an Italian game, no. Bishop to b5, no going into a Roy Lopez. A very common opening back in those days. Anyways, after the Morphy defense gets played, which is a6, named after Paul Charles Morphy, just bishop to a4, retreating the bishop backwards. A lot of lower elo players would just take this knight, but these guys have very clean chess, though the match may have been very dirty. Speaking of which, that brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Glanu Soap, an Irish company based here in my town.
Out here in the wilderness. Not because I enjoy nature, because I smell like shit. If you don't want to smell like me, grab some Glanu Soap. Be sure to subscribe.
I actually bought like 3 of these before, and I swear to God, this smells so good. It's so strong, it's completely natural, and it's got no chemicals that might destroy your skin. Honestly, if you're not using this, you're missing out. You can get a 15% discount if you use code CRASHCHESS. Link in the description. Go check it out now. But anyways, continuing on with the game. Here, knight to f6 going after the e4 pawn. Simply castles. Looks like you're giving up a pawn, but actually this is all theory. Not that I know any. Knight takes e4, pawn to d4 now, attacking in the center. And here, just pawn to b5, kicking away the bishop. Bishop drops back to b3, and if you look, it's occupying this really strong diagonal, so it's best to try and close that off. Korchnoi does exactly that with pawn to d5. Here, d takes e5, and obviously you don't want to take back because then you'd be losing a knight. So here, bishop to e6, after bishop to b6, just pawn to c3. And what this does is it actually frees up this square for the bishop in case the knight jumps to c5. And it also prevents the bishop from jumping to b4. So here, knight drops back to c5 and bishop to c2. Bishop to g4 now, pinning this knight to the queen. But Karpov doesn't care, he plays rook to e1. Here, bishop to e7, knight b to d2, just like in another opening that I've covered. Queen b7 now, knight to b3. Here, knight to e6, and white plays h3, kicking away the bishop. Bishop drops back to h5. Bishop to f5 now, pinning the knight to the queen. Now, if you look, both bishops are actually pinning a knight to a queen. I guess you could call this the pinnacle of chess. Knight c to d8 now, defending the knight, allowing this queen to move freely around the board without being pinned. Here, bishop to e3 now, developing the bishop finally. Now pawn a5, trying to kick away the knight. Simply bishop to c5. Now a4, kicking away the knight as we said earlier. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, now moving the knight to safety on d2. And now c6. I'm not entirely sure why you would play c6, but I guess the engine says this is actually okay for black, though white is at a slight advantage in this game right now with plus 0.22, so practically equal. Pawn to b4 now. Unfortunately, Korchnoi did not play en passant here, instead plays knight g5, which would be against the rules of modern chess, of course. Here, queen to e2 now, preparing to put the queen somewhere else so it's no longer pinned by this bishop. Pawn to g6 now, attacking the bishop. Bishop drops back and bishop is forced to take because there are no other squares really. Instead, pawn takes g4, knight d6, and now queen to e3. Glanu Soap. Here, h5 attacking the g-pawn. Knight takes g5, queen takes g5, queen takes g5, and now knight takes g5, trading down into a much simpler endgame. But the trades aren't done yet because g takes h5, and now rook takes h5. If you look, this rook is occupying a completely open h-file, so There could be some threats of doubling up here and trying to give a checkmate. Very unlikely at this level of chess, but you never know what might happen. Now knight to f1, trying to control some of these squares, trying to stop, if there ever is a doubling of rooks, that the knight can stop that. Rook to h4 now, putting some pressure on this b4 pawn. After rook to a to d1, king to e7, pawn to f3, giving the king some breathing room, allowing him into the position. Now knight back to e6, knight comes to e3. Knight g5 looks like a pretty normal position, pretty drawn position, so it looks like the players did some repetitions of moves to try and maybe offer a draw, but Korchnoi says he ain't interested in any of that, so he plays knight to g7, so Karpov obliges and plays knight to e3. If you look at the position now, these pawns are looking a little bit scary. Black does have an advantage on the queen side with 4 pawns to 3, so it would be most advantageous to conduct an attack on the queen side. So here, after knight comes to f5, knight to c2, trying to reduce the amount of trades at this point and maybe put some defenders on some of these squares. Just rook to c4 now, preparing to push this d4 pawn. Here, rook to d3, defending this c3 pawn, but Korchnoi plays the great move, pawn to d4. And the idea being that obviously you can't take this way because then you lose a knight, and if you take this way, then you lose a pawn. So after the pawn takes, this will be under attack, and there's not really much you can do to defend it. Sure, you can push this pawn, sure, you can put a rook here, but now the rook can infiltrate the back rank or the second rank, so it's really not very favorable for you playing as white. So instead of taking here, white plays g4, kicking away the knight, which is a defender of the d4 pawn. Here knight drops back to g7, and now knight takes d4. Makes sense now, because now you can take it without losing any material. But knight comes to e6 and rook e to d1, and now look what's happening is you're over defending this knight so that you can maintain the position in the center. Makes a lot of sense. Knight takes d4, c takes d4. Here rook takes b4, so you've lost the pawn and there's really not much you can do. Here king to f2, and you don't have a check because then the rook can just block, and that's basically it. You can't win this pawn. After you trade down, it's just pretty much equal as before. So instead c5, attacking in the center as earlier. Here just d5 now, not allowing the center to get opened up. After rook to b2 check, white should have actually blocked here with either of the rooks, but instead white played king to g3, which actually loses a pawn with very little compensation. I don't really know what Karpov was thinking here, but maybe Korchnoi's team had an x-ray on Karpov's brain to try and, get him to think differently or think wrong. But anyways, continuing on with rook to e3 now, putting a rook behind a semi-passed pawn. I don't know if you can even call it that. It's not really a passed pawn at all, but defending it nonetheless. Because this pawn is already defended. But if you look, the queen side is way too strong right now. These pawns are going to be pretty much unstoppable. So after pawn to b4, pawn to e6, attacking on the e file, rook to a3, attacking the rook, offering a trade, of course. Rook to e2, Karpov does not oblige this time. Just f takes e6, rook takes e6, and you can't really win this pawn because of king to f7. Now rook e to d1, trying to double up on this e7 square and eventually win the pawn, try and force the king away from the defense of the g pawn. So Korchnoi plays rook to d7. After rook to d7, just rook to b6, rook to d3. Unfortunately here you cannot save the pawn. So white goes after the g6 pawn, which makes a lot of sense. And now rook takes d5, and you've won a pawn and still maintained your entire advantage on the queen side. Now rook takes g6. Ooh, you've won a pawn back, but nobody cares because just pawn to a3. Rook f6 check, king to e7, rook e6 check, king to f8, rook f6 check, king to e7, perhaps trying to bait white into taking a draw by accident. Rook to e6 check, but now king to d8. So there is no draw, though it would have been a draw by repetition if black had played king to f8. Here, rook to a6, controlling this a file, stopping these pawns from being pushed any further for the time being. Rook to b7 now, defending the b pawn, and to g8 check, king to c7, rook to g7 check, rook to d7, blocking the check, rook g5, going after the c5 pawn, but here just pawn to b3, and after rook c5 check, actually white resigned here whilst in the middle of a check, because you realize that these pawns are too far advanced, though you do have your own passed pawns. They are still like 4 to 5 squares away from queening, whereas these are only 2, and there's not really much you can do. If you drop the rook back eventually after moving the king, simply pawn to b2, and you're just going to pile up on that rook, and there's going to be no way of stopping this pawn storm, as they say. But anyways, gang, as I said, this video is sponsored by Glanu soap. I have 4 in front of me right now. I got charcoal, turmeric, honey, and oats. I got bergamot and orange. And I got this blue guy right here. I got it because it was blue. But I actually bought a few of these myself. They smell absolutely incredible. All natural ingredients, no artificial chemicals, based in my own town. Pretty awesome, guys. If you do want to support them, support my channel, do check them out in the link below. And anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and have a great day.